tariffs are not going to be forever. This is a game of chicken, two economies colliding with each other, one cheating and stealing and one not. At some point, you got to resolve the issue. And I think at some time in the near future, Xi is going to call Trump and say, okay, where do you want to meet? You want to go to Geneva? Go to Riyadh?
Is he? Because I mean, whenever you hear somebody talk about this, who knows China, who knows Xi, knows Chinese culture, they say he'll never call, never. Like he cannot lose face. I mean, any communist country leader would be this way, and that includes him. That they just can't. He can't lose face. That's the last thing he'll do. And now Trump has to find a way of going to him. But Trump's kind of like that himself as well.
Well, I can assure you within the Communist Party of China, there is a bunch of narrative going on about how long do they want to do this, because the only reason you stay in power in a communist society as a supreme leader is everybody's fed. They can take care of their families and they have jobs in factories. Now, what you could do, even though they're not making rubber mats anymore because they're all sitting on the water, no one's going to buy them. There aren't enough markets big enough to replace the American consumer. There just aren't. So at the end of the day, you got to start asking yourself, okay, if I'm Xi, do I print money so that I can pay these workers and then have hyperinflation where a loaf of bread, goes up 1,000%, the Venezuelan model? Or do I work something out with Trump so all this stuff we've made can get back into the market, including that woman's, rubber bib? I mean, somebody's got to buy that. There's not enough people around the world to buy that, except you got to have the 39% of the consumers are sitting in America. That's who's going to sell the product. That's why I would think at some point, because I'm a pragmatic guy. Again, I look at the policy. I know there's a lot of politics here, but if I'm Xi, I'm thinking, okay, how do I save face on this deal? What do I do here to get things going again so the stuff on the boats gets to America with no tariffs on it? All the Europeans have the guys in England right now today are saying, okay, let's drop our tariffs on agriculture so we can start shipping grain in both directions, whatever they want out of ag. German car parts, we talked about that. All of these guys are working this out. Xi has to do that too. Now, is it going to take 2 weeks? Is it going to take 2 months? I don't know, but I guarantee you there's no scenario where Xi can outlast the American consumer, because that's really what you're talking about, Megan. At the end of the day, can he really cut himself off from the largest consumer market on earth? No.
All right, guys, so we got to talk about what I believe to be the most fascinating piece of news in the financial world is the current game of chicken between President Trump and Jerome Powell. I think a lot of people are paying attention to the game of chicken between the United States of America and China. But again, there's multiple games of chicken here. So it seems, because President Trump has indicated he's not happy with Jerome Powell's performance, okay? Because Jerome Powell seems to be late when it comes to raising interest rates, and now he's late when it comes to lowering interest rates. And it seems as if a lot of his decisions are being made to benefit the Democrats, right? He doesn't really seem to be very friendly towards Republicans when it comes to his decision making. But President Trump has started to ratchet up the pressure on Jerome Powell to lower interest rates. And the reason why President Trump wants Jerome Powell to start lowering interest rates is because the GOP is about to pass their supply side stimulus. And President Trump knows, as a real estate guy, the best way to stimulate production, manufacturing, building things in this country, which is what he wants to do, is that you have to have cheap money, right? Borrowing costs have to be low, and that is ultimately what he wants. However, Jerome Powell is not playing ball because he believes that President Trump's tariffs are going to cause a spike in inflation and unemployment, and this is why he is refusing to lower rates. However, some people speculate that if the market continues to experience volatility due to President Trump's tariffs, then maybe that will force Jerome Powell's hand. However, Jerome Powell is indicating that that's not the case, that he's not going to save the markets.
Some people believe the Fed will intervene if the stock market plummets, the so-called Fed put. Are they correct?
I'm going to say no with an explanation. So what I think is going on in markets is markets are processing what's going on. And it's really the policies, particularly the trade policy. And really the question is, where's that going to come in? Where's that going to land? And we don't know that yet. And until we know that, you can't really make informed assessments that would still be highly uncertain. Once you know what the policies are, it'll still be highly uncertain what the economic effects will be. So markets are struggling with a lot of uncertainty, and that means volatility. But having said that, markets are functioning, conditional on being in such a challenging situation. Markets are doing what they're supposed to do. They're orderly, and they're functioning just about as you would expect them to function. Where we are now, again, to your question, is the administration is, as I mentioned in my remarks, is implementing significant policy changes, and particularly trade now is the focus. And the effects of that are likely to move us away from our goals. So unemployment is likely to go up as the economy slows in all likelihood, and inflation is likely to go up as tariffs find their way, and some part of those tariffs come to be paid by the public. So that's the strong likelihood. And my hope is that we'll get through this and get back. Well, we're always going to be aiming for maximum employment and price stability. That's what we do. I do think we'll be moving away from those goals probably for the balance of this year, and then, or at least not making any progress, and then we'll resume that progress as we can.
Yeah, so basically what Jerome Powell is saying is that he has a crystal ball, and he believes that President Trump's tariffs are going to cause high inflation, massive inflation, which is what the mainstream liberal media is predicting. All the liberal economists, this is what they're predicting. We'll see, right? We will see. I don't know, but we'll see, right? This is what they're saying. And he's also saying that is going to cause massive unemployment as well, too. And because of that, there's not much room for the central bank to do much about interest rates, right? Because we're going to be in a period of stagflation, and he doesn't want to risk lowering interest rates, which would basically make the inflation situation worse, okay? Now, there are reasons why I think that Jerome Powell is wrong, okay? And I want to talk about it, but you can imagine that the markets are not liking what Jerome Powell is saying, okay? And they're currently freaking out. Wall Street is panicking. Yields are spiking. Once again, people are running to gold and Bitcoin because they are afraid of what's going to happen with the uncertainty of President Trump firing Jerome Powell and the fact that, as of right now, the tariffs are here to stay.
All right, on to Wall Street. Stocks sink in the face of tariff uncertainty and President Trump's escalating attacks on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. So the closing bell rang just moments ago. The Dow fell nearly 1,000 points. The S&P 500 down more than 2.6%. So let's take you over here to our interactive stock market heat map. This is brought to you by FinViz, showing the top 500 stocks today. Practically everything in the red, as you can see. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady here now to break it down and walk through what's happening in the markets today. Hi, Kelly.
Hey there, Jules. Yeah, another big day in the red to kick off the week. There's really two things that drove the markets down today. And one, as you mentioned, is this back and forth when it comes to the Federal Reserve. So we saw a little bit of back and forth between President Trump and Fed Chair Powell last week. That continued this morning when just after the markets opened, right around 9:40, President Trump, I do think we have the post, I'll read from it, said in part, preemptive cuts in interest rates are being called for by many. With energy costs way down, food prices substantially lower. There can be a slowing of the economy unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates. Now, he was referencing Fed Chair Powell. And as it stands right now, there is no legal precedent for the president to get rid of Fed Chair Powell without cause. It can't be just because he doesn't like his interest rate policy. But Jules, just this back and forth is creating a lot of uneasiness for investors that there is even the hint that we could be approaching a legal fight or even a possibility where there might be a new Fed chair that is more easily influenced by the White House. Traditionally, you have the Fed separate from the White House so that there isn't any influence or impact on monetary policy. So that's one thing. Even if that is something that does not happen eventually, there's just a lot of concern among investors. The other thing, Jules, is we haven't seen any trade deals yet. And I talked to a number of investors over the weekend that said, look, We were excited after the White House's reciprocal tariffs were put on pause for 90 days, but we are not seeing any of these trade deals that the White House has teased come to fruition. And there's just a little bit of uneasiness that may be weeks or maybe months into the future, Jules.
Yeah, see now you heard that. Now, I think part of the reason why you're not seeing any trade deals yet is because the Trump administration doesn't want any trade deals until Jerome Powell starts to lower interest rates, right? I think that actually is what's happening in regards to part of the reason why you're seeing the tariffs is because President Trump really wants interest rates to decline. They basically made that very clear. They're trying to drive down yields, right? Interest rates are trying to decrease the cost of borrowing, okay, of capital so that businesses can invest, right? This is what they really want to do, and they really want that to pair along with the supply side stimulus from the GOP. So I think part of the reason why you're seeing what you're saying is that is almost as if the Trump administration is trying to force Jerome Powell's hand. The question is, who is going to fold first? Is it going to be President Trump due to the fact that he has a lot of pressure on him from the markets and also everybody else as well too? Or is it going to be Jerome Powell, who also has a lot of pressure on him because of the markets, but he has a different type of pressure in the sense that the Democrats and the establishment, the liberal media, they're all behind him, right? But because the president is the president, and if President Trump decides to try to fire the guy, that is going to set up a legal battle in court. And that's also not something that the Federal Reserve Chair wants if he's so concerned about stability, right? So basically that is where we're at. And I want to react to this clip from Fox Business featuring James Fishback, who is a supporter of President Trump, because I think he's one of the few people I've seen go on television and really kind of get what's going on and make similar arguments that I've been making about all of this stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it.
My first guest says that the chair of the Federal Reserve is arguably the most powerful economic official in the United States and the least accountable. He also says that there's a difference, folks, between the Fed being independent and immune from failure. So I'm going to bring in now Azoria CEO James Fishback. James, you wrote a piece last week. It was really a marvelous piece, and you said that Trump should have the power to fire Powell, and you think also that maybe it could come through this Wilcox decision. Maybe that would sort of set a legal path for Trump to do so. Why do you feel this way?
Well, good afternoon, Charles, and happy Easter. Look, the President of the United States absolutely under our Constitution has the right to remove any executive officer, and Jay Powell is no exception. I laid out the legal argument last week, but this week I have to tell you, after Jay Powell's speech in Chicago where he was engendering all of this negativity and pessimism, he talked about 4 key areas of President Trump's agenda: immigration, deregulation, fiscal policy, and tariffs. And you know what he talked about entirely in his speech? Only tariffs. He had nothing to say about the deregulation agenda, which lowers inflation, lower fiscal spending, which lowers inflation, and reducing the immigration burden, which lowers inflation. He's selectively looking at individual parts of the economy to decide what to do. And at the end of the day, it's not that President Trump is pressuring Jay Powell to cut rates. It's that the real economy is pressuring Jay Powell to do the right thing. We're in the middle of trade negotiations. Inflation is down to 1.5%, according to the Truflation Inflation Index. Doge is saving the taxpayer money. By all accounts, inflation is already lower and headed lower from here. That's why the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada are all preemptively cutting rates. And Jay Powell, Mr. Too Late, as President Trump rightly coined him, is once again doing the wrong thing. And the president has a First Amendment right to call that out. And we're going to find out very soon, I believe he does, has the constitutional right to remove the Fed chair, which he should absolutely consider.
Wow. Again, making very similar arguments that I've made about this whole, fears about inflation. Yes, I understand that prices hasn't necessarily gone down, but you don't want deflation, okay? Even though these same people who are so concerned about tariffs causing inflation will cite Smoot-Hawley, but they'll forget to include the fact that Smoot-Hawley actually contributed to deflation, right? It actually made prices go down. Okay. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen with these tariffs. I'm just saying what you really want is for inflation to get back to under 2% and for wages to outpace inflation, right? And that's how you get real wage growth. Okay, that's how you're able to buy more things. You get more bang for your buck. You don't really want prices to go down. You just don't want prices to go up really, really fast, right? And you want wage growth, right? The actual purchasing power of your dollar to go up, right? That's what you really want. So with that being said, what Jerome Powell, in my opinion, is not considering is the fact that the supply side stimulus from the GOP is going to have some deflationary pressures, right? When you talk about deregulation, when you're talking about cutting corporate taxes, okay, when you're talking about making it easier and incentivizing companies to build here in the United States of America to produce more, right? When you talk about increasing supply, okay, that in and of itself is going to suppress inflation, right? It is going to counteract whatever inflationary pressures may come from decreasing interest rates. And again, the reason why is because you're going to have lower production costs. You're going to have an increase in the supply of goods and services, and that is going to reduce upward pressure on prices, especially if you don't have too much demand side stimulus, right? So if as long as the demand side is in check, you can potentially mitigate the inflationary pressures from lowering interest rates, while at the same time getting the benefits of more business investment, business growth because of lowering borrowing costs. However, again, it's something that has to be done in a very delicate balance, because when you talk about supply side growth, it takes time because it requires massive investment. So I think personally that Jerome Powell should start to lower interest rates gradually, like very, very, very gradually over time. I don't think he should be doing big 50 basis point drops, which is what he did right before the election to try to juice the election on behalf of Kamala Harris, which, by the way, the conditions back then were less favorable for lowering interest rates than they are right now. Okay, it's just funny how that works, how when we did need to lower interest rates, right, when inflation was more elevated than it is right now, the Federal Reserve decided, hey, it's a good idea to do a 50 basis point drop right before the election. And as soon as Trump gets in office, all of a sudden they're like, nah, we're good, right? The economy, we really don't want to lower interest rates anymore, right? We don't want to do that. We want to stop doing that all of a sudden when Trump gets in office. It's just funny how that works. So, I think that the Trump administration here, more than anything, wants to lower interest rates. And I think that if Jerome Powell starts to fold on interest rates, I think magically you're going to see a lot of the tariff stuff resolve itself. Because I think at that point, the president would be more motivated to start announcing deals, because I think a lot of this really is about forcing Jerome Powell's hand. And the way that you do that is that you got to create chaos and uncertainty so that the Fed has to step in to provide relief.
And it is obviously intriguing, because this Federal Reserve, by the way, is the only one with an official dual mandate. And I think that's hamstrung them a lot over time. And I put that on Congress. Congress gave away that obligation in the 1970s. But you've also emphasized that this is not necessarily about trial or pump. You say this is about democratic oversight. And I want to get to that for a moment, because I started this piece off showing how Powell cut rates last year, right before the election. Many people at the time thought it was politically driven. I pushed back against that. But also, it was 2 days after a scathing letter from Senator Warren. And it does feel like Republican presidents, particularly in recent history, have had a really hard time with Fed chairs. Is there something political going on?
Yeah, there is. And just look at the numbers, Charles. For every one Republican economist who works at the Federal Reserve, there are 10 Democrat economists. For every $1 donated from Fed employees in the 2020 election, 97 cents went to Democratic candidates or causes. The rate cut that had no justification in fundamentals of the economy before the election was designed to throw Kamala Harris a lifeline. And now, when there's a real justification with lower inflation in the midst of a trade negotiation, a real justification for lower rates, Jay Powell wants to do absolutely nothing except stand in the way. And so it's right that President Trump is calling this out. He has many options in front of him, but I just wish that Jerome Powell would do the right thing. Look at the facts, look at what his colleagues in Europe and Canada and England are doing, and lower rates to support our economy in this critical transition period.
So, James, many are concerned, myself included, at firing Powell at this very second, with the market as fragile as it is, could actually do more harm than good. Some have also talked about a shadow Fed chair. Would you be open to that?
I would be open and I would be honored if the president would consider me for shadow Fed chair. I've been following this for a decade now, looking very closely at Fed policy and its implications, not just on the stock market, Charles, but on real America. As we speak, President Trump is meeting with the executives of companies like Walmart, Home Depot, and Target. He regularly meets with farmers, the unemployed, retirees. Jay Powell just sits around listening to whatever 400 PhD economists say, talking about racial injustice and climate change. We need a Fed that is accountable to the American people and that focuses on the real economy. To your question, I'm going to be very honest with you. If President Trump decided to fire Jay Powell right now, the stock market would panic. But at the end of the day, our founding fathers would not want us to make long-term decisions based on the short-term emotions of a highly volatile market. I think the president should consider his options. And at the end of the day, ultimately, the American people and history, not the stock market, are going to decide his fate.
James, good stuff. I implore everyone to get a chance to read your article. And certainly the topic is moving markets today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it is moving markets. A shadow Fed chair would basically be somebody that the administration would say, hey, this is going to be the next Fed chair. And then he basically says what he's going to do, right, when he gets in office, so that the markets kind of get forward guidance on like what's going to happen, right? So everybody kind of knows like, okay, interest rates are coming down as soon as this guy gets in office, right? I mean, like you can kind of affect yields by doing that, right? So regardless, the point here is that Jerome Powell hasn't done a good job. He said that inflation was transitory. I feel like he was very wrong during the pandemic, despite the Democrat Party spending. And then now when it comes time to lower rates, he doesn't want to do that either, right? And I just think that he's making the wrong decisions. I think that the Fed is not independent. I think clearly they are ideologically aligned with the left, okay, with the Democrat Party. And at this point, I really believe that the Feds have been trying to act in favor of the Democrat Party. I just can't explain why is it you would cut rates right before the election in less favorable conditions for rate cuts. And then now when you have more favorable conditions for rate cuts, you say, nah, I'm not going to do it. And you essentially trash the president and blame the president for why you're not doing something that makes more sense to do today than it did a few months ago, again, before the election, but he did it right before the election. It doesn't make sense outside of this guy obviously being political. I think President Trump ultimately will win, not necessarily by firing him. He might fire him. But I think that Jerome Powell will fold, especially if the next inflation report, if inflation gets back under 2%, like if the next inflation report comes in closer to where trueflation is. I mean, trueflation has our inflation at like 1.3, 1.4, 1.5%. Like if inflation comes in right around 2%, under 2% in the next report, yeah, I don't see the argument that he would have to not consider gradually lowering rates. However, if the next inflation report comes in and is hot, right? If what they say happens, right? In regards to tariffs causing inflation, we'll see, right? We will see. I think a lot of people are not accounting for consumer spending going down. But anyways, if the next inflation report comes in hot, then he's probably not going to do it, right? I think that is going to put less pressure on him. But I think a lot of it is going to come down to the next inflation report or two, and then we're going to go from there. So let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.